Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar entitled Drivers of Innovation in Europe and the U.S., the Transatlantic Business Outlook for 2022 and Beyond. The Florida chapters of the European American Chamber of Commerce and the Swiss American Chamber of Commerce have collaborated to bring you what we believe will be a very interesting discussion examining the driving forces of innovation in Europe and the United States. Switzerland has been a top-ranked country in the area of innovation for many years, and within the United States, Florida has been a leading jurisdiction attracting new and relocating technology companies and investors. Our program today will touch on some of the reasons for these jurisdictions and why they're so highly ranked, but our discussion will be broader in scope and examine more generally on the transatlantic business what factors are driving innovation today. Following our panel discussion, you'll hear some closing remarks from René Riede, Board Chairman of the Florida chapter of SACC. But now let me turn the program over to EACC Florida's Executive Director, Christina Slazinska, to make a few announcements and introduce our speakers today. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alan. Yes, hello, everyone. And I, too, am delighted to welcome you to today's program. So just some housekeeping first. If you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A box. The program will be recorded and intended for informational purposes only. Nothing should be construed or taken as legal advice, and any information, questions, discussion should not relate to any client matter or issue that may be considered privileged or confidential. All comments presented by our speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the EACC or the SACC. We have a great number of registrants from Florida, but also from both sides of the Atlantic, and we look forward to a vibrant discussion. Let me introduce our stellar cast of panelists. Jared Davis is co-managing shareholder of the international law firm Greenberg, Traurig, and a member of the firm's Global Executive Committee. He focuses his practice on domestic and cross-border M&As, capital market transactions, and complex secured financings. The vast majority of his clients are technology players, including information technology, life sciences, biotech, renewable energy, and more. Jared has played a key role in Greenberg Traurig's global efforts to be a dominant player in the technology industry, and his relevance, influence, active engagement, and thought leadership in firmly placing Miami and South Florida on the innovation and IT landscape cannot be overstated. Jared is based in Miami, and we're honored that he will be our moderator for the day. Sumitra Dutta is a professor of management at the Samuel Curtis Johnson Graduate School of Management at Cornell University. He is also the founder and president of Portuland's Institute, which focuses on research and outreach on technology and innovation. Sumitra brings a unique perspective on business and technology strategy in a global world and has conducted extensive research in and consulted with leading global firms and governments on building effective technology and innovation strategies. As the founder of WIPO's Global Innovation Index, he is uniquely qualified to speak on our program today. Sumitra joins us from New York, but will soon be moving to the UK to become Dean of the Said Business School at Oxford University. Congratulations, Sumitra. Martin Naville is CEO of the Swiss American Chamber of Commerce since October 2004. Martin started his professional career in 1984 as the corporate banker with JP Morgan in Zurich and New York. He then spent 16 years with the Boston Consulting Group in Munich, Zurich, and New York, where he specialized in wealth management and telecommunications, and was elected partner and director of the BCG in 1995. Martin is based in Zurich, and we're delighted to have him with us today. Christian Schweitzer is Director, Marketing and Business Intelligence at Kaufman Rawson, one of the top CPA and advisory firms in the US. He leads the mission for analyzing, reporting, and optimizing the firm's marketing and advises clients on strategic business and marketing initiatives, as well as on data analytics and insights. Prior to joining Kaufman Rawson in 2019, Christian held a number of roles in global business analytics at IBM in India and the United States. Christian is Swiss and started his career in 1999 at Dell Computers in Geneva. He is now based in Miami, but is joining us today from Zurich. And now, without further ado, Jarrett, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christina. We appreciate those intro remarks, you, Alan, as well. Well, welcome everyone. You know, one of the hallmarks of any innovation ecosystem is idea sharing, sharing of best practices, what we call positive collisions. And the same applies to countries as well. So why are we here today? To compare practices among our, what I'd call our global innovation ecosystem. As we all know, European countries continue to lead in competitiveness and innovation as shown by the number of global rankings. The top 4 spots on the IMD World Competitiveness Ranking for 2021 are occupied by Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands, with the United States ranked as number 10 in the world. In WIPO's 2021 Innovation Index, Switzerland took the top spot as the world's most innovative economy for the 10th consecutive year, followed in order by Sweden, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Korea. So today we're going to talk a little bit about, first off, what are the metrics that go into making that determination and what accounts for this consistent role of European countries staying at the top of jurisdictions driving innovation. And we'll also talk about idea sharing and what this means on the other side of the Atlantic itself. So you've heard our distinguished panelists. The format of this is going to be approximately 5 to 7 minutes with each panelist providing prepared remarks. Then we'll go to myself as moderator with a Q&A session based on those presentations. And then since we want to be responsive to you and not simply talk to you, the audience, if you go to the Q&A section of the Zoom, not the chat, although feel free to make any comments you want there, but in the Q&A part, any questions you put there, we will try to flow to the panelists at the very end to make sure we're being responsive to your concerns and your questions as well. So with that, Savitra, I'm going to have you be the first speaker. If you could give us your prepared remarks.
Thank you very much, Jarrett, and thank you, Christina, also for your kind invitation. Innovation is something which is very high on the agenda of leaders, both in the public and private sectors. I think it's important for us to actually just take a time, a few steps backward to really ask the question, why is it important? Clearly, there's an economic rationale for it. Innovation is a very time-tested way to create new value, create economic wealth, and hopefully the economic wealth is shared. Then essentially you raise the living standards of many people in society or in the country. Besides the economic rationale, there is a very important reason why innovation is also very important from a psychological point of view. In all societies today, there are a lot of young people, and some societies, in fact, a lot of young people are a little frustrated because sometimes unemployed. Young people have dreams, and innovation is often a way to allow them to fulfill the dreams. And often technology is a very important part of the enabler that enables them to build new things, create new experiences, and essentially, create something that makes them feel that they're achieving their hopes and aspirations in their own sort of personal and professional lives. That element of the social value that innovation brings is extremely important. And we see that today, the whole tech innovation space that's happening, I think in Miami, it's happening in many other places around the world. So that's the part about why innovation is important. Now, the question that is very also interesting is how do you measure innovation? And this is something that I started thinking about, 15, 20, 17 years ago. And when I looked at what were the traditional measures of innovation, usually there were metrics that were fairly classical, I would say. Aspects like the number of publications, the number of researchers, the number of citations of publication, the number of patents, and the number of PhDs, and so on. Now, these metrics are very, very important, and they still are very important. But what we have also seen is that even innovation has become much more broad-based. Today, it is not clear you need a PhD to innovate. Yes, PhDs do innovate, but a lot of innovation happens from people who don't have a formal PhD education or sometimes even a formal education. You have farmers in India who start innovating many products. You have a lot of market-driven innovation that actually based on somehow combining existing technologies to assess some kind of a market need. So I think there is a need for us to even think about how we measure innovation properly. And so this whole effort around measurement started with this realization that the metrics being used to measure innovation were not really complete. And somehow we need to look at a broader set of metrics, a broader set of more inclusive metrics. Now, inclusivity is very important also because innovation happens not in any one small exclusive group of people. Innovation can happen anywhere in the organization. It's not just in the R&D lab of the most advanced companies, but innovation can happen also with an entrepreneur, a small business owner, or individual in some cases. So I think innovation happens across society. So if you start with this kind of a premise that innovation is more broad-based across society, innovation is something that everyone is capable of participating in and actually contributing to, you start actually then opening up the set of metrics that you can actually use for measuring innovation. So we created something called the Global Innovation Index. I, in fact, founded it in 2007. Since 2011, WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization, the UN's arm on innovation and patenting, they adopted the work that I was doing as the UN model of innovation. And over the last 10, 11 years, really has become extremely widespread in terms of a method, a way, a framework of thinking about innovation. At a very high level, of course, I encourage you all to look at the Global Innovation Index. Just search for it in a search engine. You'll find the links to it. You can download the report. What we do is we look at all the major economies, typically 130 economies around the world, and we try and assess the success or the weaknesses in innovation along a certain framework, which the Global Innovation Index actually uses. The framework has, at a very high level, two sort of categories of indicators. Some indicators are what we call our input indicators. So those are things that a society or a city or a country needs to do to enable innovation. Things that actually, for example, education, the human capital investment, infrastructure. You need good infrastructure, otherwise often you cannot do good innovation. Having the right kind of institutional policies and regulatory frameworks in place, society. These all things become very important in terms of the enabling factors. And then there are very important elements, which are the actual results of innovation. So how well and how successful is a certain economy, a certain city in innovation, in actually producing the outputs. Now, what is also important is that in that framework that we have created, we look at outputs that are both technology sort of intensive, the classical knowledge technology outputs, but also we look at creative services sector. So creative services sector, like, for example, movies or TV series, or publications or online creativity. So all these are different elements of creativity and innovation that we see in society. So what we do is we try to measure these different elements and combine them in a framework. And that framework allows us to assess how well is a country or a city doing in innovation. As we mentioned with Jarrett, Switzerland has been doing extremely well in this ranking for the last several years. We'll hear soon why that's the case. But US comes in at third position. US actually is very strong. And it's very strong, especially if you think that our measure is actually inclusive. So it looks how innovation is happening across the entire country. And US is a large country. So US is not a small country like Singapore or Finland. It's a very large economy. And for a large economy to have this high ranking actually is very, very creditable. So US certainly is doing very strong in innovation. And my last comment would be that many countries, many regions, many cities are actually using the Global Innovation Index to create more customized innovation models for their own regions. So, for example, in India, what India has done is taken the Global Innovation Index, the structure, the framework. Then they have used that to create more statewide, state-level innovation indices. And then the states actually use it for improving their own innovation infrastructure at a state level. And they also compete with each other for attracting investments or, in fact, doing other interests in innovation. So the Innovation Index has proven to be a great help to leaders and cities and countries and regions in terms of trying to understand what is innovation, what kind of levers can actually, pull or work on to actually improve innovation, and what are the drivers of innovation in society or in my own region. So let me stop out there, Jared, and hand it back to you. And I'm sure there'll be some questions on which we can go further in depth.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Before we go on, I guess just a couple of drill down questions. For the input versus output, can we give a list of some of those just so people have a stronger idea as to what specific parameters go into the calculation?
Yeah, so we have, almost like 80 different variables that go into the various parameters. So I think, I don't have a list of all 80 in my mind right now, but at a very high level, the inputs have 5 categories. So, we have a category of sort of the institutional regulatory framework in the country. We have a category of the human capital and the R&D investments in the country. We have a capital of the infrastructure in the country. Infrastructure is very important. If you don't have good ports and roads, you can't really innovate successfully. We have a sort of bucket of variables around the market infrastructure. How easy is to, for example, to get capital, to to operate in the markets in some sense. On the output side, we have 2 buckets. One bucket is on the knowledge technology side, and there we have lots of variables around traditional variables like patenting, but also other interesting variables like startups and high-tech ventures and so on. And then we have the creative services sector, which is really new for innovation metrics. Traditional innovation did not look at those metrics. And we look at elements like, the whole issues of the creative services like movies and films and so on, and also the online creativity. So there's a number of different variables that go into that framework.
And how is it weighted? Is it possible for a country, let's say the U.S., you mentioned how powerful it is on diversity, but maybe perhaps weaker on other items. Is it possible for a country to be so heavily weighted with respect to certain variables that it completely offsets weaknesses in other variables? How does the weighting calculus
go? It's a very good question. So we typically assign equal weights to everything. But having said this, think of it like links in a chain. You have a chain, and each link has to be strong for the overall chain to be strong. And this is what we find in innovation. Why do some countries do better innovation? Why does Switzerland do well in innovation? Is because it's strong uniformly in all the different components, all the links. Now, if you look at, for example, the US is very strong in some. For example, research and R&D and technology outputs, very, very strong, number 1 in the world. But in some elements, actually gets pulled down. Infrastructure. Infrastructure is an area where US is actually weaker. So, if one link is weak, the overall sort of ranking on the innovation sort of chain becomes weaker. So the answer would be you need to be strong in all the links, and that's what makes the innovation game much more harder. You cannot just work on only one thing. You've got to work on multiple things. You can have great entrepreneurs, but the regulatory environment is bad or the institutional environment is bad. You don't have success innovation in the country.
Perfect. Now, I'm going to want to drill down into how governments use your index in terms of policymaking, but I'll do that afterwards because that's going to go into more macro discussion with you, Martin, and Christian as to how these governments are impacting innovation through policymaking. So, Martin, with that, let's move on to your formal remarks.
Okay, thanks, Jared, and thank you very much for inviting me with this very illustrious body. I'm very pleased. So even though I'm on vacation in Davos, I'm very pleased to do this. Now, the question is, why has Switzerland been number 1 for consecutively for 10 years? And the answer is very simple. We are brighter, we are working a lot harder, and we're looking much better. We're much more beautiful. Beep, everything's wrong, except the more beautiful. Maybe that I'll leave open. No, we have 4 big reasons for success, in my view, or 5. The first one we can go over very quickly is infrastructure. In Switzerland, every pipe is renovated every 20 years, even if it's not broken. We renovate everything long before it's broken. Everything works, and the trains are normally on time. That's an easy one. And then there are 4 things: education, money, internationality, and granularity. And I'll quickly go through those 4 elements. And that very much fits into what Sumitra said. It's not, individual thing. It's really a whole value chain that has to work together. And if you have a weak link, it doesn't work. So let's start with education. We have the best university on the continent with ETH. On the top 10 universities, you find 7 American, 2 Brits, and ETH of Zurich, the best on the continent. And then a very dense network of university of technical schools. And then probably the magic ingredient is apprenticeship. With apprenticeship, and Sumitra said it very well, not everybody has to have a PhD to be innovative. With apprenticeship, about 80% of our youth have a job when they are 20. And when you have a job, you have technical capabilities, and you will be a very important part in labs as a lab technician, in IT as a programmer, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't have apprenticeship, you miss a lot. That's the education part. And then obviously comes the money. Switzerland invests about 25 billion a year in research and development. That's 3% of GDP, which is not a lot. We're only number 9 in percentage of GDP. For example, Austria spends 10% more and is only number 18. So money per se doesn't give you the money. That doesn't give you success. The secret ingredient on this one is in Switzerland, 2/3 of the R&D money is privately funded by large corporations. Only 1/3 is funded by the government. And that's normally in most countries, it's exactly the country, it's 1/3, 2/3, 2/3 from government. And that's a very important point, because then if you add internationality to this, and Switzerland is very international. We're export world champion. If you look at the number of global Fortune 500 company per head, we're by far number one. We have 2 per million inhabitants. America has 0.4, Germany has 0.5. Very international, large companies, which bring two things. One, international competition, which you need for innovation, because you need this competitive feeling. If you're in the comfort zone, you will not innovate. And it will also bring a lot of cooperation with other companies, other universities, and this is where you get the ideas from. And then because it's driven by companies, there is really a strong market orientation for research and development investments. So it's not state planning where somebody in Bern or in Washington decides what's going to be important in the next 2 or 3 years. It is really companies who, on a very micro level, are going to decide every day what's the right thing to be innovated on. And that's really a complementation of the ecosystem, which is really important, is every day you get this market-driven element to this. And the fourth, after education, money, and internationality, is what I call granularity. In Switzerland, everything is very granular and everything is bottom-up. So we have no mega programs a la EU Fit for 50, where you have those enormous programs with a lot of money. That doesn't happen in Switzerland. In Switzerland, you have this bottom-up planning with constant optimization, and the government funds are awarded on a competitive basis driven by researchers' individual initiatives. So it's not somebody who said, we should do X. It is a multitude of universities, of scientists, of people who come up and go into a competition for innovation funds. And that's really the major point, is there is very little public interference. So our agencies, the Swiss National Fund, the InnoSwiss and the Swiss Innovation, all give a certain framework with rules on how to apply money. They give a certain framework on how to consider projects, and then everything else is done on a competitive basis on a very macro level. So this is what I call the granularity. And I think that the secret of innovation, Switzerland being number one, is this combination of education, money, internationality, granularity, which is very difficult to duplicate. So if country X says, I want to do it like Switzerland, is a very silly endeavor. Is like, in Switzerland, some people say we should do it like Silicon Valley, which I think is a very silly proposition. You should not imitate, you should go for your own USPs. And I think Switzerland has some very clear USPs in this. We will discuss a few problems that we have currently, but I think, this is really a very, very strong foundation to build innovation on. I'm done. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. It's interesting. We always hear the expression, all politics are local. Sounds like all innovation is local. You start the grassroots, the ground floor, work up from there, as opposed to being at the very top where you may not have the perspectives necessary to accomplish it. I guess one question I would ask is, you always hear from certain sectors the argument that it should be government, should be policymakers at the high level, because there may be more of an incentive to encourage collaboration. The concern being that if it's by private enterprise or by corporations, they're going to want to be proprietary with the innovation that comes up, keep others from getting it, so they don't want to compromise their intellectual property rights. What do you say to folks like that? How do we see in Switzerland that even though most of the innovation is being done in the private sector, you still have that robust ecosystem, that robust environment of collaboration and sharing ideas? How do we see in Switzerland that idea sharing occurs, notwithstanding the fact that private entities will have a vested interest in protecting their intellectual property rights?
Yeah, I think first, why should government know better? I mean, they're one remote. I'm not a government basher, but why should they know better where and how to innovate? And then in Switzerland, again, we have this very strong Let me give you two examples: ETH and Disney Labs. Disney Lab is the largest Disney lab outside the US, and they have a 50-50 sharing agreement where the responsible for Disney Lab is also a professor at ETH, and they have a 50-50 arrangement, and both can use the IP freely. It is very revolutionary for Disney. But if you do it the right way, then it works. Second example, we have IBM Labs, the largest outside the US, just outside of Zurich. And they have built up one of the best labs for nanotech. And it was a 50-50 arrangement between ETH and IBM. But again, a very clear rule book on IP. And it works. It works much better than if the government basically starts to decide everything. And so I think it really should be left to those who know, with those who have an incentive to do it, and not have, the moment you have somebody in government who puts up a program, you get a commission and you get an office, and you get a lot of people who have to fight for, to qualify for their job every day, and to make sure that they are needed all the time, and they're really interfering to the most important process, which is a bit of a chaotic process, but it should be left, it has to be stochastic.
Sure. And it seems like Switzerland has that perfect mix. We did mention, I guess, a third of financing does come from the government sector. What does that look like? Just so people can understand, the private sector is driving everything. But I guess the government does play some role in that. What does that look like?
So, for example, the Swiss National Foundation has quite a bit of money. And there are 15 people in this foundation, and they're all professors from exactly those fields. So you don't have government employees, you have professors. So my brother-in-law was responsible for neurosciences for about 10 years, and they give out projects which come in a very competitive manner. So they don't define, now we're going to go for AI, and in AI we're going to have a specialty, and we're going to look for a project in AI. This all has to come up. And then to compete with each other across all those scientific directions. And then they will assign certain money. Another one is the Swiss Agency for Innovation Promotion, the InnoSwiss, which again promotes certain project, but they don't start project. It's a reactive thing. It's the judge. It's creating some equity, creating some rules to assign money. And Switzerland Innovation is a brand new network of innovation centers. Which are not startup innovation centers, but there are centers which are starting to get built around Switzerland to bring together government, the small government, large private sector, and the universities. And they should, be a cooking pot, a melting pot, again, in a slightly dirty, slightly chaotic, slightly stochastic way. But that's how innovation are not created on an agenda. Innovation are created on the coffee machine. And let's create the large coffee machine, and this is what government is here for. They have to create the coffee machine in the corner, and then everybody else is fighting for that money and being very creative.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, you'll notice, everyone, that Sumitra started with sort of the most macro perspective in terms of the Global Innovation Index and how it applies to various countries and how you're using it as an assessment tool. And now Martin has brought in to specific examples, i.e. Switzerland. Now we're going to bring it to the U.S. and Christian, with his background at Kaufman Rosen, particularly with Florida, because as Martin mentioned before and as Sumitra mentioned before, Florida also has been a hot pot of innovation activity, particularly South Florida, where Miami, Florida resides, and where I have the privilege and Alan has the privilege of practicing law. So Christian, I'd love for you to give your perspective on everything that's been talked about, but particularly through the lens of the United States, and particularly given, let's update everyone on what's going on in Florida itself. And by the way, before you start, Christian, let me encourage everyone, if you have any questions, we're here to serve you as the audience. If you have any questions, please post those in the Q&A. I do commit that at the very end. I'm going to try to ask as many of those as we can so that we're being responsive to you. Christian, you have the microphone.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be part of this great panel. Do you see my slides that I'm sharing right now?
Yep, we can see them. The first slide, drivers of innovation.
Yeah, that's on a normal circumstance, I will be in that beautiful new building in Coconut Grove, Miami. I'm now personal reason and business reason in Switzerland, but we'll be back there soon. First, a little bit about myself. I would probably say this is what you can see when you look me up on LinkedIn. As said before, I work for Kaufman Rosen, do marketing for them. I have been an adjunct professor for a few years for the University of Miami, where I'm actually teaching what I do for a living as well, which is marketing analytics. And I'm also the president of the HBA's Alumni Angels Group, an angels investor organization here in South Florida to try to bring together startups and innovation young companies with investors. And of course, I'm a dual citizen. I usually say that I'm 100%, I'm a 200%er, meaning 100% Swiss and 100% American. So with that said, I want to give you a little bit of an overview. How does the ecosystem in South Florida look like for innovation? And this is a chart that I borrowed from Emerge Americas. Emerge is an organization that tries to bring together the South America and North America on innovation and technology and new companies and so on. And this is a very good example of many different ecosystems. Could apply to any other areas in the US or even internationally. And we're just going to talk about a few things, what it makes ecosystem to be good or bad in the example for here in South Florida. So obviously you have education, universities. In the case of South Florida, we have a lot of young universities. The oldest university, University of Miami, is a little bit short of 100 years. When they were found, the oldest university in the United States, like Harvard and others, were way more than 200 years old already. So a very young system to actually build talent and bring up new possibilities to get to innovation from the beginning. As a second, government. Government has been extremely active in South Florida. And if you would live in South Florida, you would have not missed, a few tweets from the mayor of Miami and others on how much they talk about innovation, how much they talk about technology, and how much you have really a lot of hands on deck to really help making this area, the system, successful, and how government actually can help. Government obviously has two main areas where they influence, all type of business innovation, regulations, and taxes. And I would say, South Florida has two very big advantages in that area. There's no state tax. Florida is one of the 11 states that still don't have state tax in the state. Next, investors. So it all starts, of course, with the money. And we have seen a huge income on possible investors, on funds or organizations of funds that actually started in Miami. Actually, my organization that I started a few years ago, the Angels Group, also has not, many years behind them now, but there's all new organizations and VCs and Angels Group that actually help to bring investments to help startups, to find money. Next, I will go to the actual startups. So startups, have been always an area where it's all around Silicon Valley, and even today, I would say probably 85 to 90% of startups somewhere have their home in Silicon Valley. But it's changing rapidly, and not just, for Miami. You see other states or cities, Austin, Texas, for example, Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, they all see kind of like a little bit of an uptick because many people actually realize you don't really have to be in the Silicon Valley to be successful. You can be anywhere in the world. Specifically, the pandemic helped a lot in driving that. Then the media. It's always good to have the media on your side. And that's clearly the case, I would argue, here in South Florida. You even have newspapers like the Miami Herald hosting and organizing pitch competitions, for startups to take part of it. And therefore, you have the good news being spread and the nice information when there's like a new exit of a company, a new unicorn coming out. You somehow hear this in the media, and it obviously is a good positive momentum to build on. And then lastly, the enterprises. Enterprises is probably still one of the weaker areas when it comes to the ecosystem here in South Florida, but it's changing there as well. So you see a lot of organizations, enterprises, they discover South Florida and they see the advantages, that are there. I wish, and I actually hope, and I'm almost convinced that we will see more larger organizations building their headquarters in the Florida area or South Florida area than we have today at this moment. Now, if you look at the innovation happening, so I would say two really main areas need to happen. You need to have investors and you need to have innovations and entrepreneurs. And if you can somehow bring those together, and eMERGE is one of the organizations that actually try to do that, and many other organizations as well, you will see have the first step, the first most important step done to actually have innovation being successful and growing in your area. Now, this is kind of like a map slide, how the ecosystem looked like 7 years ago. So you had a few organizations in South Florida that were somehow oriented with innovation and startups. But if you fast forward to today, or actually this is something I did last year, so it's already 2022, this is how the ecosystem looks today. So much more organizations, much more personal and institutional entities that actually help and exist to make the ecosystem flourish, successful, and specifically growing further on. If you ask me what are the industries that are mostly dominant or will be dominant in the future, there's not really one that I want to specifically point out. They all will have a good growth, I'm convinced, here in South Florida. The medical device industry has been something that was successful quite some time. We're probably going to continue to see success there as well. And you have obviously climate tech, real estate with what they call, prop tech and blockchain, with the new events and conferences that actually are holding place in Miami, will probably be a big driver as well. And if you want to ask me, how does the future look like? I would say for the region, it looks bright. If I want to see how it's going to look like in 2025, I still would say we're not really there yet, to have everything in place to be as big as Silicon Valley, even we don't really have to be. But I would say the future is very promising because of a lot of elements being in place and growing in the ecosystem in South Florida. And who knows, maybe one of those next unicorns that will be announced, already exist here. It just have not been discovered yet. And another part is, it's not just Miami that actually counts here. This is a big collaboration for the region. So it's South Florida, similar with New York. It's not just Manhattan, it's the region. It's the collaboration across state borders or even international that makes it actually successful. And I think we're going to see this here play out nicely as well. And maybe it's a little bit back to the future. I don't know if you knew this, but most likely you are watching us here now on a PC or on a mobile phone or something like that. And two companies, Motorola and IBM, both. IBM actually invented the PC in Boca Raton, many years ago. And Motorola had their first labs, for the mobile phone as well in Davie, Broward County. So I want to leave you with this small fact, who ever thought that you're actually watching this on technology that has very, very deep roots into South Florida. With that small fact, Jared, back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Christian. And in fact, that facility, the Motorola facility, which became IBM facility, or actually the other way around, it eventually is now the current headquarters for Magic Leap, which is a top unicorn within South Florida. South Florida has a very fertile atmosphere of unicorns. I was thrilled to see you use eMERGE data. Our firm actually played a role in founding eMERGE, and we still function as general counsel for it. So, and we agree that they're doing some amazing work out there. Quick question for you: how's the pandemic, in your view, how's the pandemic influenced the ecosystem in South Florida, and for that matter, the entire United States? What are we seeing out there?
I would say, it was already imminent before, but, the fact that an inventor doesn't really have to be in San Francisco because the investors are there to actually have his business and can be anywhere they want, really helped a lot. And I think that was, making a big driver as well. People are not choosing to live and have the business based on where the investors are, just because, they're going to go there where they think they can be most successful or where they mostly like it. And I would say that happens, be a plus for the region in South Florida, but not only South Florida. You see this also for other cities like Atlanta or even Austin, Texas, Chicago, Boston. They also feel the impact that you can work from everywhere, and you don't need to be in Silicon Valley.
Perfect. So what I'd like to do is evolve the conversation into a more granular discussion as to how each of these jurisdictions, meaning the EU, the US and Switzerland encourages innovation. You know, Martin did a great job of walking us through how it's the focus in the private sector, it's the focus on the local perspective, it's focus on that granularity that results in it. But I'd like to talk from a policy point of view. And Sumitra, I'll start with you, but heads up, Christian, I'm going to go to you as well because this involves the US. Sumitra, how compare and contrast how the US tends to support and promote innovation versus the EU? And with respect to the EU, can we explain to the audience how Horizon 2027 works in the EU's role in this arena? First, define it, obviously, and then go into a little bit of just how it plays into the EU's philosophy when it comes to sparking innovation.
No, sure. I think, the US stands out in multiple ways, but certainly some of the dimensions in which it stands out in our computations on the Global Innovation Index is, for example, on ICT adoption. US firms are the world leaders in the adoption of information technology. And I think, in some sense, the investments in ICT across sectors in the US dominate other countries in the world. The US also dominates in venture and risk capital. As we know, the US pioneered the venture capital industry and remains a leader in this space. And that actually does a lot to help, support funding in young startups, and also, more important, help with key management functions, just serving on boards and advising on business strategy for these startups. The US has a long culture of entrepreneurship. I think the whole sort of deep-seated interest in tinkering, inventing, making things better, and then being able to scale up rapidly, given the large country, is a very important success factor of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is a cultural strength of the US. I see, I sort of divide my time between the US and Europe, and I see that the US students, young Americans, are much more entrepreneurial than, let's say, young Europeans, who also are very good from an intellectual preparation point of view, but perhaps on the entrepreneurship side, a little bit less risk averse and a little bit less likely to sort of, face up to failures in the right sense. Now, I can give you other examples in, science technology collaboration between universities, universities and government collaboration, the trade and tax regulatory environments, but a number of other factors on which, US does extremely well. Now, Europe is also not a poor performer, although Europe is not one entity. Think of Europe as being a collection of all the different countries. It's like collecting all the different states in the US. So yes, there are differences across states, the differences across Europe too. And Europe has a number of, interesting initiatives in place to support innovation. Europe has strengths like, for example, good education and good policies to support patenting, to support good institutions, and so on. Europe also has weaknesses like, for example, market fragmentation. The market fragmentation in Europe today is a real serious issue because it's very hard even today for an entrepreneur in, let's say, Portugal to serve a customer in Poland easily and effectively, not just given the language differences, but also the differences in laws and local litigation and so on. Now, two important initiatives in innovation policy are in Europe. In Europe are Innovation Union and Horizon Europe projects. The latter, Horizon Europe, is especially important because it promotes an open science policy, which is basically a mandatory open access to publications and open science principles applied throughout the program. And second, it actually encourages a new approach to partnerships, much more objective-driven, much more ambitious partnership in industry than as before in support of EU policy objectives. The good thing about both these things is that US is in fact an important participant in some of these initiatives. In particular, for example, Horizon Europe, which is focused on tackling the major challenges of our time, the green and digital transitions, and for example, the successful exit of the pandemic. The US has the highest level of participation in EU research and innovation programs of all non-EU and non-associated countries. So US universities are very strong, and US research and innovators have, teamed up and worked together with researchers in Europe and for many years as part of Horizon Europe.
So, Martin, how does Switzerland flow into those efforts? We talk about Horizon. I would note that obviously Switzerland's not part of the EU, and there was an association agreement under Horizon that was being negotiated, but I guess it was halted. Is that a big handicap? How does Switzerland's role as a non-associated nation interlink with the EU's efforts in terms of sparking innovation? What collaboration efforts do you see between the two jurisdictions?
Okay, as you mentioned, Switzerland has been associated on the predecessor program, which was called Horizon 2020. We are not associated anymore. Last June, the EU came out with a list of the 27 countries of the EU plus 18 countries they invited to be associated. That's Israel, Norway, and the usual suspects, plus Armenia, Albania, Faroe Island, Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, not Switzerland for political reasons. We're currently in a spat with the EU on conflict resolution, on things like the automatic takeover of EU laws, etc. So the EU currently wants to punish Switzerland or to push Switzerland into accepting some of those rules which have nothing to do with science. And so it's very deplorable that Switzerland is out of this. Switzerland can still participate in some programs as long as it's funded by the Swiss government, which is fine, but Swiss professors at Swiss university cannot lead most of the important projects, and they cannot participate in competition for the European research grants, which is really a large handicap. And this is, it doesn't automatically create disaster, but already now, starting the last semester in September, a handful of professors, of highly ranked professors, did not join ETH, GPFL, or the Swiss universities because had they taken the job, they couldn't lead the program. And so long term, it will be very detrimental. And there's a lot of push, from the scientific body in Europe who really want those Swiss universities because they really bring a lot of value to the program. But also there's a lot of push from many parts in Switzerland that the Swiss government finds a way to get Switzerland back on, because medium and long term, it's really, really important. It's a great program that has the granularity, that has the contact to the industry, the internationality. And so it would be very detrimental to Switzerland long term if we are not part of Horizon.
I'd like to drill down on the point of education. Several of you have talked about it. Martin, you believe it's one of the 5 pillars of Swiss success and innovation. Christian, you mentioned the universities in Florida, and Sumitra, you mentioned it as well. Sumitra, this question is for you. What correlation have you seen? At the very beginning of your remarks, you actually pointed out quite correctly so that increasingly we're seeing less of a focus on formal education. You don't necessarily have to have a PhD in order to be an innovator. Having said all that, what correlations within your index are you seeing between IP education of all of its types? And definitionally, feel free to go into what that means. But what correlation are you seeing between IP education and innovation itself?
So we do see a correlation, a positive correlation between the two elements. What is much more harder to state is that causation element. Is it because you have strong IP that you have more innovation, or is it because we have more innovation that you have strong IP rules and so on? The causation link is much more harder to disentangle, but yes, you do see a strong correlation between the two. And what we see is that in countries or regions where there is a strong respect for IP, innovation actually moves faster because innovators, they feel they can actually benefit from the investments and efforts. In regions where there's the opposite, I think the innovation goes slower because people actually have question marks about whether or not they can protect the R&D and interesting new ideas.
In a way, it's interesting, Martin, we could almost potentially combine this with your observation that the private sector is the fastest catalyst for IP innovation, because absent having that respect for IP and absent having that respect for education, it would almost have to be the governments that take over because they're the only ones that could encourage collaboration. But as long as you have that respect for IP protections, then you can have the private sector do what it does best, which is sparking robust innovation. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Would agree. It's government should set the rule, and IP protection is one of the rules. And then let the people who are closest to the innovation process define what the priority should be, and not somebody in Bern or in Washington. So I think it very much has to do, and IP is one of the most important rules of the game, that everybody is ready to play the game, and you don't have to look for government for help and for protection and for guidance and for priority setting. So very much in your line.
Christian, how do you see that playing in the U.S., particularly Florida? What challenges do you see in the Florida innovation ecosystem? We understand that it's robust, it's growing at faster growth rates than most places on the planet. But what challenges do you see out there, including what we're talking about with education?
Education always has been a little bit of the lagging part in South Florida. People were saying, it's difficult to get talent. And once you get talent, people are hesitant to move to South Florida because there would be no other jobs, if it would not work out. So that's a challenge. And we need to somehow overcome this fear that there's nothing else, available in South Florida other than kind of like the job you're being offered to go to. And I think South Florida already does the right thing, to have education really scale up on those very important skills to make education actually work very closely hand in hand with the private sector to find out what is actually really needed as talent in those innovation companies, and on the regulations as well. So Sumitra, you mentioned the culture, and Martin, you mentioned kind of like the IP. I'll give you an example where the US and the European countries differ. If you have a new idea, if you have a new innovation, you want to file a patent in the US, you file one application and you have covered with the United States on your property. If you want to do the same thing in Europe, you file for each country to actually register your innovation. So those are some examples on regulatory items that we need to see how to overcome them on the European side. US has the challenges as well, from an investor inhibited reason, tax reasons, all these things, and how much we're going to tax people coming from outside. But I would say when it comes from an innovation process, there should be less hurdles for an entrepreneur to go through to actually get started with his venture.
Sure. Martin, Sumitra gave a very helpful outline of the sort of strengths and weaknesses that each of the EU and the US has. I'd like to get the same question from you, but in a different way. My question to you is, what could the US and the Europe learn from Switzerland? And then what could Switzerland learn from the US itself?
The second question is really easy. I think, first of all, we should not imitate. We have two secret formulas, and it works really well. And as Sumitra said, being third, if you have a whole continent with all the states that are very different, being third is really, really strong. And for Switzerland as a small country to be first is really, really strong. Let's not imitate each other. We both have our success formula. But I think Switzerland could learn from the US is just the risk taking. In Switzerland, if you're an entrepreneur and you go bankrupt, you have this little dark mark here, and then don't go close to banks anymore because you join the government or join a large organization, doing some administrative stuff. Don't call yourself entrepreneur, which is totally wrong. Why should an entrepreneur be successful on his first try? You don't learn to ride a bike on your first try. What the US could learn from Switzerland is I think, this first of all, the education piece. I mean, we have had a memorandum of understanding with the US of trying to explain to especially governors and mayors what vocational education training is all about. This is not bricklaying. This is high quality paraprofessionals who have a job at 20, and that's a really important part. And the second thing is having the more driven, have a better coordination between the top down, the Washington, D.C., the great program, the Warp Speed, but they were very much top down, successful this one. But when you look at now currently the infrastructure bill with $1.2 trillion, that's 1 or 2 and 11 zeros, that is really driven from Mr. Buttigieg somehow, and then the bottom up, the granularity, and I think there the US really can learn a lot of things from Switzerland.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to go to the Q&A in our last couple of minutes, so it'll be responsive to our audience, although I threaded one question in. Sumitra, the first question here is from a individual in Pakistan, and it's to you. It says, particularly in Pakistan, imitation of successful products and processes are done so smartly, yet lacking proper patenting and copyrights. Where does imitation stand in the innovation index ranking for developing nations? So as opposed to de novo innovation, we're talking imitation.
Yeah, so we don't have a specific variable for measuring innovation. It's more because of the fact that we don't have a variable that measures enough number of countries. So you can often have innovation or copying metrics that use software or some specific products in some countries, but not large enough. So The issue is not there in that metric per se, but having said this, we do have IP protection in the framework. And so we can measure the impact of IP protection inside Pakistan. And clearly what you see is that the lack of IP protection, lack of adequate IP protection does hurt innovation in the country. Yes, there'll be some copying, but fundamentally, I think progress and moving forward will be slowed down.
Then we have another question. Are there any international U.S. agencies, ombudsmen, that are there to protect entrepreneurs when state entities pursue and replicate ideas and IP that develop in the private sector? Who determines which jurisdictions take precedence globally? And I'll make that a jump ball question. Whoever feels comfortable answering that one.
Well, I can take a shot at it. So I think typically, you want to provide some protection for your idea by patenting it in the most important markets you're targeting. Usually, it typically is your home market and some of the global markets you're trying to address. But also with WIPO, you can in fact today file protection at the same time across multiple markets. So WIPO has made it easier to do that in recent times through its various processes.
Yeah, and wearing my lawyer hat, I would just mention, to the extent you're a private sector entity and you feel a state actor is somehow intruding, immediately I would contact the whatever Ministry of State or State Department in the case of the U.S. You can contact, and then they can address it. And it's going to be a function of whether or not there's an applicable treaty in place that protects you. By definition, if there's no treaty that protects it, then the state actor, unfortunately, can infringe. So it's going to be highly fact specific. Christian, we have another question here. This one's for you. You mentioned that media has been helpful in South Florida. Could you give some examples of how they've been helpful in providing momentum to innovation? How have they taken their role as town crier and helped spark the innovation that they cover?
Yes, so in South Florida, we have to celebrate, every big success that we actually have, because, we're still growing and we don't have it. And the media just does that. They actually cover those successes, and you hear and read about them. Plus, they are actively engaged in helping with the innovation system. For example, the Miami Herald, the largest newspaper in Miami, is organizing and hosting a startup pitch competition. So, which is something that not many actually media outlets do, but the Miami Herald decided this is something important for the region, and they actually put hands on and host and fund also this competition for startups to participate and win prizes and funding for their ventures.
Perfect, thanks. By my clock, I'm seeing we have 2 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is bring in Renee Rieti to give closing remarks. But I want to thank each of you as our panelists. You've done an absolutely amazing job. And you've given everyone a lot of food for thought just based on the comments as well as the Q&A. And I encourage everyone to reach out to you offline to pursue this line of dialogue further. With that, Renee, I want to give you the mic to give closing remarks, as well as Christina and Alan.
Thank you, Jared, but also Sumitra, Martin, and Christian for covering the topic and identifying some of the key drivers of innovation in Switzerland, in Europe, and the US, particularly also with a view to Florida, as we have seen. My name is René Riedi. I'm the chairman of the Florida chapter of Swiss American Chamber of Commerce. I was given the honor to summarize and close this event. Being a Swiss national, I'm obviously very proud to see Switzerland being repeatedly named as the most innovative economy in the world. And it's just not a title. There is real value behind. Let's assume that you would agree with me. Research and innovation emboldens Switzerland's attractiveness and competitiveness as an economy. It offers university, institutions, and industry opportunities to compete, but also to cooperate internationally, as we have seen and heard, and helps attract bright minds and create jobs. And this is just to name a few. But this is all at risk, considering the fact that Switzerland, due to the rejection of the institutional framework agreement with the EU, has been locked out of Europe's Horizon Research Innovation Funding Program. The consequences are not yet visible in its entirety, but it may become harder to defend the top spot as the most innovative economy without access to important research projects run at an international European level. It will be interesting to see how Switzerland is handling the situation and get out of this. But let's watch the space. Equally interesting was a short excursion to Florida and a visit of its startup ecosystem. As we speak, we become witness of the Sunshine State's transformation effort to become the next technology hub. In the name of both the European American Chamber of Commerce, Florida, and the Florida chapter of the Swiss American Chamber of Commerce, I would like to say thank you for participating in this virtual event. I hope you enjoyed. I would also like to thank Greenberg, Traurig, a Miami-based world-leading law firm, for hosting it. The next event organized by the European American Chamber of Commerce, Florida, will come up in March, where it will host a delegation of European Union officials who will be visiting Miami for a series of specialized meetings focusing on resilience. On March 11, the Swiss American Chamber of Commerce will host its annual Swiss Miami Golf Open at the club in Weston Hills. Details about both events can be found on the respective websites. This webinar has been recorded, and the recordings will be made available on the websites too. And this brings me to the end. Again, thanks for attending, and I wish you all a successful continuation of your week, and all those from Europe an enjoyable evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everyone.